In this video, we're going to look at the email provider in NextAuth and specifically customizing the email that's sent out to the users when they want to create an account or sign in to our site. So let's get into it. We're going to build on top of a project we have done previously on the channel where we implemented NextAuth inside of our NextJs 13 application. I'm going to include a link in the cart so you can watch that video to understand how we got here. And then in this video, we're going to just add an email provider, and specifically we want to customize the email that's sent out. Now, the email provider uses email to send magic links that can be used to sign in. So using the email provider allows your users to sign into your site without having to come up with a password. So it's not the credentials provider whereby the user has to have a credential such as an email and password. They just need an email and they can sign in, create an account and sign in to your site. Now, having the email provider in addition to your OAuth services, for example, in this project, we have the Google social login. It allows the users to use the same email on their Google account to also sign into your site using this magic link. So NextAuth is going to link the two accounts that are using the same email, whether they were using the Google OAuth or the magic link. It's going to link the accounts together so they can also access their account using their email if for whatever reason they lost access to their OAuth account, to their Google account. Now, how it works behind the scene is that on initial sign-in, a verification token is sent to the user's email. This token is only valid for 24 hours. And once it is used or they click on that link within the 24 hours, an account is going to be created for the user for the first time, and they're going to be signed in. Now, if they provide an email that is an existing account, that magic link is going to sign them in to that account. Now, to store the verification token, that's the important part in the email provider flow, we need a database. We're going to store that verification token in a database until the user actually clicks on that link so that we can verify and create an account or sign them in. So regardless of the session strategy that you're using, whether you're using a JSON Web Token strategy or a database session strategy, you need to have a database adapter so the email provider flow can store this verification token. Now, NextAuth lets you send emails either via HTTP or SMTP. Now, the HTTP, which is a more modern way of sending emails, it's using an API client, sometimes an SDK like a JavaScript client to send post requests to your endpoint of your cloud provider. And the SMTP is the more traditional way of sending emails. So let's start by SMTP. Let's go to the NextAuth documentation where you can access different providers from this list of providers. I've selected the email. Here it talks about how it works, just as what we covered already. And then as the configuration, we're going to dive into the HTTP in a second, but let's start from the traditional SMTP. You would need to install the node mailer package because now it doesn't come out of the box inside the NextAuth package. Before, it used to be a part of NextAuth. Now you need to install it as an extra dependency. And then once you have done that, you have to create a connection string. It is typically in two forms. It's either the first that you can see here, there is an email server. Inside of this connection string, you can see there is the host, the username, and also the password. And then you have an email from. This is typically your verified domain or verified sender email. And there is a second way that you can set these environment variables or the details of your SMTP server, and that's through a configuration object whereby you have all of the compartments of this string in different variables. So you have the username separate, the password, the host, the port, and the email from. And then you would pass this into the email provider from NextAuth to your next config. We're going to see this in a second, but to that email provider, you would provide a server key where you just pass in an object that has the host, the port, and the auth. Now for this, you might use services such as SendGrid. You can create an email API client. It is going to give you these information about the SMTP connection that you can use to actually send the emails. So the node mailer package, it is what actually creates this connection or creates the transport, and it uses this information for your specific SMTP provider to send this required email. Now, before we go to the HTTP client for sending our emails, let's actually look at how we can customize this email that's sent from NextAuth when a user tries to log in. So if you scroll down inside the documentation, you would see this customizing email, and you can actually pass in a function called send verification request. This is the function that gets invoked when we want to send that email. Under the hood, it is using the node mailer package we just installed together with the information that we provided for our SMTP service, and then sends the verification email. Now, this function requires or receives some parameters, such as the identifier, which is the email the user just put it inside of our form. The URL, this is the link that they're going to actually click on inside of their email. And we also have the information from the provider. This is the same information that we passed on to this email provider config. Okay, so if you wanted to customize this email, this is the email that's actually, this is the default verification request function you can see from NextAuth. And down here, you see they have defined two functions, the HTML and text. The HTML is responsible to getting these parameters and returning an HTML email. And then the text is just responsible, which is a function down here at the bottom, which is responsible to just return a text version of your email if your email provider or the email client doesn't actually support HTML. So if you wanted to customize this HTML or this email that's going out from NextAuth, you could just tailor this HTML to your liking, and this is what is going to be sent to your emails. Okay, let's now look at sending emails using the HTTP client. If you scroll up top of this same document where we talked about different ways you can send emails via the HTTP or SMTP, you can see there's this HTTP and a guide that you can click on. It takes you to NextAuth. It takes you to Auth.js, which is a more modern version of the NextAuth, which is framework agnostic, meaning that you can use Auth.js with other front-end frameworks like Svelte, for example. It's not specific to Next. Currently, the documentation is going through the transformation. Some of the guides are still in NextAuth.js. Some are here. Nonetheless, I'm going to include the link in the description so you can find this guide. It tells you how you can send an email using the email provider via HTTP-based clients. I'm going to go back to my own note because I have summarized the steps you need to take. You're more than welcome to read this. Now, inside of our config, where we talked about different ways, let's just dive into the HTTP. As we just saw together, there's a built-in email provider in NextAuth that allows you to connect an SMTP server of your choice to send magic link emails. But it also allows you to use HTTP-based clients or services like Amazon, SES or SES, Postmark, SendGrid, or Resend. Now, last week in a previous video, we also talked about sending emails in your NextJs app using the Resend service. We also looked at making those emails nicer using the React email, which is from the creators of Resend. We're going to actually use both of them today to actually send our verification request email or magic link email. Now, similar to using SMTP, you still need a database adapter. You would need this to store your verification tokens. You can then generate an API key from your cloud email provider. I'm using Resend, so if I go to my Resend account, there's this API key section where you can create a new API key to include inside of your project, inside of your environment variables. So you shouldn't expose that to your client side. This is something that you would use server side to send emails. And once you've done that, you can just add this config to your NextAuth config. We're going to see this in action in a second, but the idea is we're going to create a custom provider. We're going to give it an ID. In this case, it's Resend. Its type of email, and then we're going to pass in a custom send verification request function that actually uses Resend to send an email instead of the traditional way of using node mailer that's built in or by default used by NextAuth. Now, all that's left to do is inside of this verification function, we just have to call our HTTP endpoint of our own client provider or cloud provider or email provider. In this case, we are using Resend. Resend comes with an SDK that you could use to send this request instead of having to use fetch to hit endpoints. You can just use the JavaScript client. We're going to, again, see that in a second. Just a little note, I've already mentioned this, but the identifier and the URL are sent as parameters to this verification request, so you can use that to know where to send the email and also include that URL that the user needs to click on inside the body of that email. Now, once you create a custom provider like this, when you wanted to use this custom provider, you can call in the sign-in method and then refer to this custom provider by the ID that you've specified here, in this case Resend, and provide the email of the user. So let's jump back inside of our application and see this in action. So inside of our app, API and auth, NextAuth catch all route. This is where we have defined all of our config to initialize NextAuth. So we have this auth options and we're exporting this NextAuth handler as a get and post. This is again the tradition in the API or in route handlers inside the app router. Now again, I've talked about this in different videos. If you don't know how route handlers work in NextJs 13, I'm going to include a link for you to learn about them. But basically, you have to export named functions from your route handlers. That's why we're exporting this handler as get and post, which is going to respond to get and post requests to this endpoint. So inside of our auth options, in the prior video, we had the Google provider here. But now I have added this custom provider with the ID of Resend and a type of email. I've also included this send verification request, which is a specific function we're going to define together. And the rest is exactly the same as what we have done in the previous video. Again, you can watch that if you want to understand what all this is doing. So let's jump inside this send verification request function that I have defined inside of my utils folder. So I'm receiving these parameters by NextAuth, specifically the identifier and the URL. I'm creating a host out of that URL, and I'm going to use the Resend library that we have downloaded, or the Resend function, to send an email. Now, to use Resend, again, you can watch the video that we had last week on the channel. I'm going to also include a link in the cart, but it's pretty easy to use it. If you go to the documentation, literally you have to install the package. You can then create a template or use React email as your template. And all you need to do is to create a new instance of your Resend by calling this Resend class and passing in your API key. And then you can use this object to send emails. You have to specify from to subject and what exactly you're trying to send to this function. And that's what we're doing here. So inside of our lib, just to show you, I've created this Resend where I am getting an instance of this Resend and providing my API key. And I'm just bringing that whole thing back inside of our send verification request function, where I can just use that object to send an email. Now, inside of our email, you have to pass in your verified domain. Again, from your dashboard on Resend, you can go to domains and you can verify your own specific domain so you can send emails from that domain. If you don't have a verified domain, what you can do is to use this onboarding@resend.dev email. But this only allows you to send an email to yourself. This is going to be your verified email address. But if you just want to test it out, you can use this onboarding email. But if you want to use this service, it's better to verify your domain. So going back to our function, we are passing this identifier, which is the email of the user. We're going to include a subject, a text version of our email in case the email client on the user side didn't actually support HTML, and the text is this function down here that includes that link inside of a text for the user. Now for the HTML version of our email, we are using this React key inside of Resend that allows us to pass in a React component. You can pass in your own custom React components, but the problem with emails is that not all CSS properties or all HTML elements are supported inside of different email clients. So therefore, it's better to use a service like React Email that makes sure your emails are actually rendered correctly, regardless of the email provider that your users are using. Now for that, I have created this magic link email template. So let's just dive right into this from a high level. I've included this emails folder inside of my project where I have this magic link email. And I have got the inspiration for this magic link from the React email. So if you go to React email inside of the examples or inside of the docs, you can also see these examples where they provide some examples here that you can use as an inspiration. I've used this Notion magic link. It gets you the source code for it, and then you can copy this in your project and install the packages necessary for React email to work, which is this React email components, because you're importing different components that comes from React email. Let me just go back to the docs. As you can see here, they have different components that you can use to render your emails. So this is the first package, and the second package is React email itself that is required for you to be able to send or template your emails using React email. Now to this template, I'm passing the URL and host. I'm just passing a link for users to click on, some titles that we're going to see in action inside of our email in a second. So I'm passing in this component or this email template. It's a React component. You can call this component as a function and pass in the props that it's expecting. These two are coming in from the data that's passed to us from NextAuth. If it's successful, we're going to return success true. Otherwise, we're going to throw an error. So this was adding the email provider and this custom verification email from the NextAuth point of view. Now let's go back inside of our application where we're actually rendering that sign-in page so we can hook that form up with the sign-in method to actually call this specific custom provider we added. So inside of our app, we have this sign-in page. Let me just close this off so we have more room. We open up this sign-in page. Inside of it, we are rendering this Google sign-in button. Let me just go back to the application. If you click on the sign-in, this is the page that we're trying to actually update. We have this Google sign-in button that we hooked up in the previous video. This top part of it wasn't working. I've extracted it into its own email sign-in form, where we actually have a simple little form with a text field and a button to submit. And I've just added a handle submit function. Now there's more that you need to do with this form. For example, you can add data validation using Zod or implement this form using React Hook Forms. Again, there's a video on the channel where we walk through actually creating a contact form using React Hook Forms. We would verify it with Zod and we would send or submit that form using server actions. So you can combine what you've learned there or watch that and then implement that here too. In this example, I kept it simple. I didn't add validation to it, but you have to do this to make sure that the data that you're sending to your own servers is verified and validated. Now let's look at this handle submit for a second. We're preventing the default behavior of our form submission. We're getting the form data by calling the new form data on the event target, and we're reading this email field from our form data. Now the magic is here that we call this sign in method from NextAuth React. This is how you can sign users in or start a sign in flow inside of NextAuth by specifying or passing in the specific ID of the provider you want to use. Now this resend is the ID that we already initialized inside of our next config, so inside API and route. This is the custom provider I created with this ID. So I'm trying to call that same from our page. Let me just go back. So we're calling that specific provider. It needs an email because that provider is of type email, and I'm passing in the email. I'm also including the callback URL because the default behavior of NextAuth is to bring the users back into the page that they were on when they try to start the sign-in flow. So it's a good user experience. So if they were on the home page, they will be returned back to the home page once they sign in. But if they were on a different page, we capture that page and then redirect them back to that page. Now, to capture this callback URL or the page that they were on when they were submitting this form, or if we have any callback URL set inside of our URL, I'm using the use search params hook from Next Navigation. This is a new function in NextJs 13. You can use it inside the app router. It's going to only give you the search parameters of your URL. It's actually an instance of URL search parameters, so you can call methods such as get on it to get the callback URL if there is any, or just default to the home page. So once you click this sign in, it's going to pass that email and all the necessary links and verification tokens to that send verification request function we just created. Inside of that send verification request function, we're going to use the Resend package to send an email, and then the user is going to have that link to click on and to come back to our page. So let's test this whole thing out and see if it works. So hello at hamedbahram.io. Let's just say continue with email. This is going to send us to verify request page. This is a built-in page that comes out of the box with NextAuth if you haven't created any. Which says check your email, a link has been sent to you. If you want to customize these pages, going back to our API where we're initializing NextAuth, you can pass in different pages to your NextAuth. For example, here I've specified that for the sign-in page, I want to use my own sign-in page, and that's the page that we were on. You can also pass in a custom page for your verification, for your errors, for your sign-out, and whatnot, or use the built-in one that comes out of the box in NextAuth. So let's go back to our email. We should have an email right now that's coming from our site, which says log into localhost. There is a link, if you can see here. And if I click on this, I'll be redirected back to the application, and this time I'm signed in. Now going back to our email, I just want to note that as you can see, this is not the default style of NextAuth. Now if you're customizing this style, this is something that I changed from this Notion template from React email. So let's recap. Using the email provider in NextAuth, you can send magic links for users to just log in using their email without any passwords. We need a database adapter to also store the verification token until the users are actually clicking on that link to log in. Now there's primarily two ways that you can send emails. The traditional way is the SMTP service, which we looked at, and the more modern way is to actually use HTTP based clients. Now we also looked at creating a custom provider inside NextAuth by passing in an ID and a type, and also specifying a custom send verification request function where we're actually calling Resend instead of using the node mailer package with an SMTP service. We are using Resend and React email to customize our email and to also send our email. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments like always, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.